There's plenty of evidence of Book of Mormon era civilizations along the river in that area. In fact, there's one north of what we call Zera that's an unbelievably sophisticated big site.
Is it a mound?
It's not just a mound. It's a mound and other structures around it.
Like when you go to Fort Ancient and you see the breadth of the walls that were put on there.
Yeah.
And you're just like...
Well, have you ever thought to yourself, why didn't I learn any of this in high school? Why didn't I learn this even in college, in my history classes? And I'll go down to these other exotic places. North America is never included in the list of the archaeology.
All the description in 3rd Nephi was validated by the people who survived during this earthquake at the New Madrid Fault.
With the 16 cities that were either sunk into the depths of the sea or covered with land, how big of an effect do you think that has on us looking at where it could possibly happen today?
What's up, guys? I'm super excited about today's episode. So you are watching bonus content from the new book. Actually, it's kind of an old book, Moroni's America, but this is the 2nd edition. The subtitle for the book is The North American Setting for the Book of Mormon. So this is a really fun book about geography, and if you're looking for something with actual details that goes book by book, verse by verse in some instances, laying out a coherent map of the Book of Mormon in the Heartland, this is it. If you believe the Book of Mormon happened in Mesoamerica, but you're curious on what the other side of the argument is, check it out. I highly recommend it. If you are a Heartlander and you want some more detail and actual pins in a map, this is the book. So we're really excited. We partnered with digital legend Boyd Tuttle for this book because he's a good friend of ours. And what Jonathan Neville has done in the 2nd edition, besides the 3 more bonus conversations that you'll find in the book, he has added a whole new section about the origin and setting of the Book of Mormon. And then scattered throughout the whole book are a bunch of evidences that didn't exist 8 years ago when he put out the 1st edition. And so it's a whole new book, and we're super excited to put it out. So even if you've bought this in the past and read it, you have not, because this has a whole bunch of new information. Link in the description. Buy it, and you will not regret it. It's a fun book. We'll see ya. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome, everybody, back to the Plain and Precious Publishing Studio. We're here with Boyd Tuttle, a digital legend, and the author, Jonathan Neville. You just barely finished section 2, where we started to get into the geography, and this is where kind of the meat of the geographical argument is made and kind of laid out. So this is the bonus content. We're going to talk about what you just read. We're going to talk about more than what you just read. So give an overview of your, if you have to give your argument that you're giving in section 2, what is it as succinctly as possible?
Well, that's a tough thing to summarize, but I think the gist of it is that we know the Hill Cumorah is in New York. And based on that, we kind of had to interpret the text to make sense. And it could be, I've pointed out in some of my other materials that you could have the Hill Cumorah in New York, and the rest of the events take place in New York or in North America, or in all the way down to Central America, or all the way down to Chile. And people have proposed all those scenarios. And so you have to think, well, what is the most sense? What makes the most sense? So I came up with a few assumptions that we talked about already. You read in the chapter.
Call them the pins in the map, right?
The pin in the first pin in the map is Hill Cumorah, of course. And the second pin, just purely from a hypothetical standpoint, is Zera across from Nauvoo, because that's what DNC 125 says. By the way, one time I was on a tour of the Midwest, and my wife couldn't go, so I had a roommate, and he was from the Reorganized Church, Community of Christ. And he was really interested in this idea of Zera. He looked through his scriptures. They'd never canonized that revelation. What we have is DNC 125 was never accepted by the Community of Christ. And it's one of those sections in the Doctrine and Covenants that's pretty obscure.
Yeah, it's a toss aside. No one ever really pays attention to it.
People just kind of ignore it, and it's why is it even in there kind of thing. And he was really upset with his own church for not putting it in there.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I don't know if you pull it up, you want to read it.
Yeah, I got it right here.
Okay.
So I'll just read the whole 4 verses because it's really short.
Yeah.
What is the will of the Lord concerning the saints in the territory of Iowa? That's such a weird state name. Iowa.
Yeah.
It just sounds weird. Doesn't sound like a real name. Verily, thus saith the Lord, I say unto you, if those
who call themselves by my name and are essaying to be my saints, if they will do my will and keep my commandments concerning them, let them gather themselves together unto the places which I shall appoint unto them by my servant Joseph, and build up cities unto my name, that they may be prepared for that which is in store for a time to come. Let them build up a city unto my name upon the land opposite the city of Nauvoo, and let the name of Zarahemla be named upon it. And let all those who come from the east and the west and the north and the south that have desires to dwell therein take up their inheritance in the same, as well as in the city of Nashville or in the city of Nauvoo and in the stakes which I have pointed, saith the Lord. So right here, it's the assumption that's being made here is that he's having them call it Zarahemla because that's what it was called before.
Yeah, well, it said, let the name of Zarahemla be named upon it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the Book of Mormon, it says that they named their cities after the first person who lived there.
Mm.
And so when that phrasing is real interesting. Let the name of Zarahemla be named upon it.
Mm-hmm.
That's consistent with how they named sites in the Book of Mormon. Now, it doesn't say this was the site of ancient Zarahemla.
Yeah.
So that's why I say it was just an assumption that I made, purely for kind of like in a scientific experiment. You know, you have
We'll see
your
if it
hypothesis, and see if it works. And so Cumorah, I consider a fixed pin in the map. The only way you can say it's not in New York is if you say the prophets have been wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also the Zarahemla, as referenced there, has some other elements. So it does sit on the west side of a major river. It's also at a place where the river could be crossed on foot, right? Which is super key, especially if you're trying to defend a territory from the only place that your enemies could
Come
cross,
from.
or you can control that space. There's other reasons, you know.
Well, another one,
besides that.
an interesting one topographically is that area across from Nauvoo is in kind of a depressed area. Geographically depressed.
Yeah.
And all around it is the plains of Iowa. And so to go to Zarahemla, the city of Zarahemla, you have to go down to it, and then you come out from it. You go out, what they call up and down, basically.
Yeah.
And so an elevation.
elevation.
And it's been that way for who knows how long, because the Mississippi River is always changing course. But in that area, it hasn't changed course like it has further south. And so there's plenty of evidence of Book of Mormon era civilizations along the river in that area. In fact, there's one north of what we call Zarahemla, 20, 30 miles north. It's an unbelievably sophisticated, big site.
Is it a mound?
It's not just a mound. It's a mound and other structures around it. And now that I think about it, I probably shouldn't have brought it up because it hasn't been publicly disclosed.
Yeah.
But I've seen the aerial shots of it.
Okay.
And they've leased it to a farmer to preserve it. And it's amazing. It's massive.
Really?
And that's totally bonus content. I should see if I could get the video, you know.
Yeah, we can get the video. That'd be
because
epic.
when I saw the video, I was told not to talk about it. And here I just have. So
yeah. Hey, well, we can
Bonus
edit it out
content.
if we need to.
yeah, okay. I'll see what I can find.
See what you can do.
But the point is, there's another place along the river called Malcho Mounds, and right on the plaque it says it was occupied from about 400 BC to 400 AD.
Malchoa Mounds.
Malchow, Malcho Mounds. And that's a significant one along the Mississippi River. And, of course, that obviously fits with the narrative of the Book of Mormon, right? Because when Zarahemla fell, when the Lamanites destroyed it, and this was back when Mormon was the commander of the Nephite armies, and they had to abandon Zarahemla and retreat towards Cumorah, that was about that time frame, around 400 AD. So... anyway, you can.
It's kind of crazy, yeah.
Yeah.
So because you've written a book called The Lost City of Zarahemla.
Right.
It's another book in your library.
Yeah.
Do you talk about it? You talk about it extensively in there.
I don't talk about the geography much at all. Just about that revelation I do, because there was some misunderstanding about it earlier. Some people thought, well, it was called Zarahemla before this revelation was given.
Yeah.
And it turns out that that's not the case. The revelation was the first time it had been named Zarahemla.
Okay.
And so, but the reason I called that book, we'll digress a little bit, The Lost City of Zarahemla, was that in the early days, we had that revelation, it was named Zarahemla. And then in the Times and Seasons, there was an article saying that Zarahemla was down in Guatemala. And so people said, well, if it's in the times and seasons, it must have been down in Guatemala somewhere. And since then, even the what I call the M2Cers, the Mesoamerican two Comoros people, they say, well, the particular site that they identified in the times and seasons doesn't fit any models, so that was just speculation. But still, it had to be somewhere down there, right? And so I say the city of Zarahemla was lost because we should have known from the revelation that that's where it was.
Mm-hmm.
We got distracted into Central America because of these articles in the times and seasons, and now we're coming back to where it was originally.
So is that the main qualm that people that purport that the Book of Mormon happened all in Central America, with that revelation not accepting that as this is just, it's renaming the place that was already named Zarahemla, is because of those articles in the times and seasons?
Well, that's where it started for sure. And then people just started saying, well, like Benjamin Winchester's one that I wrote that book about in particular. And his idea was that because these civilizations in Central America were so sensational, that if we could get people to think that was the Book of Mormon lands, then they would read the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a marketing thing, basically. And the Stevens and Catherwood books, the illustrated tours of Central America, were huge bestsellers. Everybody knew about them. And those articles in the Times and Seasons quoted from those books. And some people think Joseph Smith had read those books and endorsed them. That whole book explains why that isn't the case. I don't know if you want to get into that bonus content, but that's a long topic.
That's a long topic, yeah. Which we did have a conversation about it on the Stick of Joseph YouTube channel, which we can link to.
One other point about Zarahemla is, unlike Jerusalem, when the Lord named another location Jerusalem, he had added New
Jerusalem.
So to distinguish it from the old Jerusalem. And in this case, he didn't say New Zarahemla, which would make us think, well, that's not the old one. It must be a new place. He's just attributing it. But in this case, he called it by the same name. So it's an indicator that could be the very same location.
I don't have a magnifying glass, but I don't think it says new on there. I didn't see. But
no, it does.
No, that's a really interesting point right there.
Yeah.
That is really, and I'm looking at these Malcolm Mounds thing. So I went to Malcho Mounds, or however you say it, right? But I went to Ohio with Wayne May and checked out a bunch of the mounds there, and at the end of the day, if not all of those mounds were from the Book of Mormon civilization or what, it is absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many questions to be had about why they did those shapes, why they did the sizes, what was the purpose of each of them, because there seems to be some mounds that have a certain purpose and others that have another. And when you go to Fort Ancient and you see the breadth of the walls that were put on there, and you're just like, how is this? And then they're like, what's the purpose of this? And they're like, it was a ceremonial site.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
They needed 2 square, it was more than 2 square miles of ceremonial site, or maybe this is what they call it, a fort. Maybe it was a fort. And it's really, really interesting
Well, and
stuff.
don't forget, Joseph Smith himself said they were crossing the plains of the Nephites and digging up their bones as evidence of its divine authenticity. So he identified, I don't know if Wayne mentioned this to you, but he identified the Hopewell bones as Nephite and the Adena bones as Jaredite specifically.
Yeah, the really big skeletons they called. Yeah.
So there was a site outside of Nauvoo that was an Adena burial site, and he said, well, those are Jaredites, leave them alone.
Yeah.
So he made the distinction, and this is really fascinating because in the 1900s, early 1900s, there was a book, I think it was called Cumorah Revisited, and it was a disaffected, I think he was RLDS, but anyway, Mormon. And he said the Book of Mormon can't be true because we know there was only one civilization in North America, and the Book of Mormon says there were 2 civilizations, the Nephites and the Jaredites. And so, but what he didn't know is archaeologists later discovered there were 2 different civilizations that correspond. There was the Hopewell and the Adena. But that was discovered after this guy wrote this anti-Mormon book. And that, I think, in my own view, that book was one of the things that caused this whole focus on Central America. Because the first guy who really focused on Central America, the limited geography, as they call it, was an RLDS scholar named Stebbins. And then the guy that followed him was named Hills. Now, this is a simulation speaking, by the way, because the 2 hills Cumorah theory was invented by a guy named Hills. His last name was Hills. I just love that aspect of it. But anyway, so this L.E. Hills, Lewis E. Hills, actually published a map in 1917 showing Cumorah down in southern Mexico. And he figured the whole thing took place down there. And they said, well, Oliver Cowdery never claimed any revelation, so what did he know? It was just ignore what he said. And they didn't, at the time, they didn't have all the information that we have today from what early church people said about it, about Cumorah. But so this L.E. Hills invented this map and said this is where it all took place. And it's basically the same map that Book of Mormon Central shows today, over 100 years later.
Yeah.
And at the time, the reorganized church had a committee, I guess, studying Book of Mormon archaeology, as well as James Talmage's committee that looked into it. And they both decided, well, we're not going to settle on any maps. They rejected L.E. Hill's map. And Joseph Fielding Smith said, well, the idea that Cumorah is in Mexico is invalid. The church has been teaching it in New York for over 100 years, And yet the scholars just said, well, the prophets were wrong, and we think Cumorah's in Mexico. So that's that whole genesis of it, and that's what that book was about, to talk about how do we ever get this idea that it was in Central America.
Central America, yeah. Well, now that we're talking about hills, this is real bonus content. We just barely got back from England. We were interviewing Margaret Barker, and we were doing some filming for our documentary. And we went to a place called Silbury Hill. And did you guys know that there are mounds all over England?
Oh yeah, I visited lots of them.
Are like they look the exact same as the mounds in the United States. Which is just crazy to think about. This mound, Silbury Hill, was insane. It's the tallest prehistoric man-made mound in Europe. It was bigger than any of the ones I had seen on my tour with Wayne. Granted, we didn't see everything because you can't travel everywhere in 5 days. It was absolutely massive. It was 130 feet high, and it had similar volume to the temporary Egyptian pyramids. And it's made out of white chalk and limestone. It was a pyramid. Right now, it just looks like this.
Oh yeah, it's all.
But they haven't uncovered
overgrown.
it. But at one point, there was a massive pyramid that is equal in volume to the contemporary pyramids in Egypt in 2500 BC, built in England somewhere, and there is like a whole moat around it. And so there's this white edifice that reaches up to the heavens, that big, with a pool of water, a reflecting pool all around it. And you're just like, what is going on with this? And why is this not a bigger deal that there's a giant pyramid in the middle of England?
And why are we not uncovering this as well? That's what's frustrating so much about what you just said about that Mormon book that talked about how there was only one civilization.
Right.
And that person said, we know.
Yeah.
Like the arrogance that you have to have to look back thousands of years and go, yeah, we know.
Yeah.
It's like you are making your best guess, and a lot of times it's not even the best guess possible.
Yeah.
And so it's just really frustrating because, that's what it.
This is what it looked like originally.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
It's a step pyramid. Like, so it's just crazy.
But yeah, it's so frustrating, and that's why I love. I don't know.
What were you
I was about to say something rude, but anyways. Just let's have an open mind and not lay claim on, history that happened thousands of years ago as if we were there to watch it all unfold. But
well, have you ever thought to yourself, why didn't I learn any of this in high school? Why didn't I learn this even in college, in my history classes? It's like North American archaeology is the least interesting archaeology. It's like, oh, you got to be a loser to do that. And I'll go down to these other exotic places, in the Southeast Asia or Mesoamerica or Egypt, Rome, all these amazing. North America is never included in the list of the archaeology.
Now there's England. It's just
England.
We think about medieval when you think about England, right?
Yeah.
And yet you have and there's other places in Europe and stuff where there's just incredible archaeology that is like just dismissed. And I think there's a reason behind why we don't study these things, because they have too much to teach us.
They have a lot to teach us. They're
and
being
remembering
hidden.
who is the God of this world.
Yeah.
He doesn't want people to research North American archaeology. He doesn't want people to know about the amazing civilizations that were had in these places
until the right time.
That would bear witness to the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, for example.
Yeah, so that's awesome. Okay, so we got that. That's kind of the intro. A lot of little bonus content in there that we were talking about. So you talk about that's the pins to your geographic model.
Right.
Now, one thing that is interesting that you talk about is like the use of the word seas.
Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about that because that is something that is very new to me.
Okay.
So explain that basically.
Well, the Book of Mormon talks about sea west, sea north, sea south, and so on. And it also talks about the great deep that they crossed, right?
Yeah.
And one of the questions that is always raised when I talk about Book of Mormon geography is, well, where is the sea west? Because when you look at a map, you have North America, you have the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And that's too big of an area.
That's a huge area.
That's a huge area. And you look at the Great Lakes, and you could argue, well, they're kind of north and east and west, but they're not south, you know. So you have some confusion about where these all are. So one day when I was actually I was preparing for a presentation on the Book of Mormon geography, and I didn't know where the sea west was. And I had like a day to do
Figure it out.
And one day I had this kind of, I would call it an epiphany or an idea come into my mind about, well, what is a sea? And I said, well, that's a pretty good question. So I looked it up in Strong's Concordance, under the Hebrew Concordance. And the definition they gave there of the Hebrew word that they used for sea had several examples.
Yeah.
But one of them was the Nile River. And I said, what? You know, I thought that's not a sea. And it said, yeah, Isaiah and Nahum both used that word that's been translated as sea for the Nile River. And so in Strong's Concordance, one of the definitions it gives is a mighty river. And I thought, well, okay, what river is more mighty than the Mississippi River, right? And then I found that passage in the Book of Mormon. It refers to the sea west south. And I thought, well, when I saw that, I thought, well, that means there's more than one sea west. And I thought, how does that work?
Whoa. I actually said, right here. I'm looking up. So the Hebrew word is, it's pronounced, I'm just barely learning Hebrew, so it's miyam. And right here, Strong's Concordance 3,220, a sea, the Mediterranean Sea, large river, an artificial basin.
Yeah, see?
So,
looking at 2 Kings 16, verse 17, it talks about they took down the sea from off the brazen oxen.
Yeah.
Now that's a baptismal font.
Yeah, it's
right?
not like a sea. It's a body of water.
Yeah, it's like a pool of water. It can be, so the definitions are so broad for that word, and we often associate it just with a salty place.
Yeah.
But it has a lot more meaning.
Well, and the other fascinating thing about the Mississippi River is that whole drainage system, when the settlers went over there, reminded them of the Nile River. That's why we have Memphis, Tennessee, right? There's a town in Illinois called Cairo. Well, they call it Cairo.
But it was originally Cairo.
Cairo. And they called the lower part of Illinois Little Mississippi. Little Egypt. They still call that when you go there. And it's because it was warm enough down there that the crops would grow more than they would in the north. And so it was kind of like a food basket. And so, but all along that drainage system, they use Egyptian names because that's what it reminded the settlers of.
You know what? Something that's very interesting that I'm seeing here too.
What's that?
And I don't know the implications of this. We might have to dig more into this. But the word for sea and the word for west have the same root. So if you're looking at all the uses of the root of this word, westward, on the west, all of the things that are talking about west also sea. So it's the same root of the word. So I have no idea what that means, but it's interesting that we're talking about the West Sea here, and this word goes to both of them. It's very strange.
What I would assume is it's because the Mediterranean was on the west of Israel, and so they would relate the two that way. But the term sea itself has more meanings.
Yeah, it does have more meanings.
Because the Sea of Galilee, the Red Sea, and so on.
And these old Semitic languages, specifically Hebrew, like there's so much that we don't know about them. Recently, a new Hebrew Bible, so forever, the something Briggs, what is it? The Hebrew dictionary, I can't remember what it is, but it's the Briggs something. Hebrew dictionary was like the Hebrew dictionary, and they just released another one like a couple weeks ago that has 8,000 new Hebrew words in it.
Oh, really?
And they're all the Hebrew words that we didn't know existed until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls and started translating. And so it's like we have no idea what's going on here, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like that we have to go through all of our scholarship again and find and see if there's other meanings to these words, you know what I mean? So I find that to be very compelling, though, that it seems like sea in the Hebrew just means a large body of water of some sort, right? Or a small, like the basin, right? The brazen sea, they call it.
We have to take our mindset away from the word sea and apply it to their definition.
Just means body of water.
It could be river. It can be any number of things.
That's crazy. Awesome. Okay, so that is a total different. That opens up the North American model way more, because I think one thing, as we've talked to people, and rightly so, they look at those and they're like, well, there's nothing here in North America that has that much water surrounding it.
Right.
So the Yucatan Peninsula seems to be a good example of that, because it is limited geography, which you pointed out. It can't be the whole continental United States, right? So it has that limited geography, and it has seas that are flanking it in pretty much all directions, right? Depending on how you orient the map exactly.
And the geology shows us that the Great Lakes in centuries past was much larger than they are now. They were much higher elevation, so they actually encompassed much more space than they do today. And even in today, they are 1/5 of the world's fresh water. I mean, it's a massive amount of lakes and water in that region, the Great Lakes area. And to imagine they were even bigger, with large swamps that extended out from them and so forth, probably as much as 60 feet deeper than they are today.
Holy cow.
That covers an enormous amount of territory, and so it makes for a lot of water up in that area.
And along those lines, there's the passage that says the land was surrounded by water, or nearly surrounded by water. And people think, well, it must be the ocean. Yeah. But water includes lakes and rivers as well as the sea.
Yeah.
I mean, and I have a section of that you read in the book about that. So it doesn't have to be surrounded like an island.
Yeah.
But it can be surrounded by a significant enough river to be a barrier that would surround something.
Here's a question that I have. With the 16 cities that were either sunk into the depths of the sea or covered with land, how big of an effect do you think that has on us looking at where it could possibly happen today?
Well, the Mississippi River is very fascinating. In fact, the original capital of Illinois was called Kaskaskia, and it was on the banks of the Mississippi River, and it was the largest city in Illinois when it was the capital. But then the Mississippi River changed course, and now it's on the other side of the river. And today there's only like one family that lives there that farms that whole area, because the Mississippi River looks like spaghetti. If you've seen that, there's a picture of it in the book, and it changes course so often that it just inundates cities that are built along the side of the river. And so when the Book of Mormon talks about those cities being submerged or swallowed up, that's how what would happen if there was an earthquake along the Mississippi River. And it's well documented. I mean, there's the Geological Survey has done a lot of these maps that you can see on the government websites and see how much it's changed course. There's a lot of Supreme Court cases, actually, with the states arguing about where the boundary would be, because they initially defined it by the river, and then the river would change course. So now, which river are you going to use? And it's really pretty amazing to think. You've probably, in the book we talk about the steamboat Arabia. I don't know if you've ever been there, but this is a steamboat that sunk in the mid-1800s, and it hit a submerged log tree basically in the river, and it sunk so fast that they couldn't get all the stuff off of it. The people just jumped overboard and swam to shore.
Holy cow.
And so some treasure explorers, who happened to be Community of Christ people, by the way, they went searching for it. And they were going up and down the river with their ground-penetrating radar and stuff. And some farmer said, well, what are you guys doing out here? And they said, well, we're looking for this ship that sunk called the Steamboat Arabia. And he goes, well, it's under my farm. He said, when I bought this farm, the old boy told me that there's a steamboat underneath my farm. and it's about I think it was a mile and a half from the river.
Yeah, it was a long way.
And so they said, okay. They went over there with their ground penetrating radar, and sure enough,
They found
they
it?
found it, and
And
they dug
excavated
it up,
it.
and it was under like 100 feet of topsoil, and they excavated the whole thing.
100 feet of topsoil.
It's unbelievable. Did you see the pictures of it? Well, there's a picture in the book, I think, that I put
Yeah.
in there. And so there's a museum now in Kansas City you can go visit where all the contents of this ship they've put in a museum now. You can visit. It's fascinating. But yeah, look up Steamboat Arabia, and you can see there it
Holy
is
cow.
right there.
They had
Yeah.
to dig that deep.
And that was only after about 100 and some years. So imagine over 2,000 years.
Oh my
could
gosh,
be
that
buried.
completely changes like
know.
how I
I've
look
never
at
heard about that
everything.
either.
Yeah.
Like
I
we
know.
have no
It's
idea
not on
then.
the surface.
I know.
Like and
So I'm telling you.
that's
Oh.
and people, let's all take a bite of humble pie. Let's all just take a big bite of humble pie because that thing was buried 100 feet under the ground after just 100
Yeah,
years.
that's right.
That's insane.
I know.
Holy cow.
And it's an awesome museum anyway, but it explains when you read the Book of Mormon, how could a city disappear, you know?
Mhm.
Well, it's easy.
Yeah.
And in fact, the new Madrid earthquakes of 1811,
Yeah, let's
1812.
talk about that because
Okay.
that's one thing that, a lot of geologists will be like, a lot of the geologists that I've met that are interested in Book of Mormon archaeology lean towards Mesoamerica
Right.
because of the darkness and the black
The
smoke and all
volcanoes
the
and, yeah.
volcano. And they're like, the only place where there's a massive amount of volcanoes is in, Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this new Madrid earthquake because it provides some sort of solution potentially.
Absolutely,
right?
it does. Yeah, when people ask me about, well, there's no volcanoes around Cumorah or whatever, I say, well, there's no volcanoes in the Book of Mormon either. So
Yeah.
what are we doing?
There's
you
just
know?
black smoke, and that's what people
Yeah.
say.
Vapor.
Or
Yeah.
black vapor is how it's explained.
Black vapor where they couldn't light candles or whatever.
Yeah.
So light fires. And so what happened in the New Madrid Fault, which is along the Mississippi River, it's anyway, you can look it up on a map exactly where it is.
Yeah.
But they had a massive earthquake in, I think it was 1811 and 1812, right? And it was felt as far away as Boston, which was,
They estimated
1,000 miles.
it was over 8 on the Richter
Yeah,
scale,
yeah.
which has never ever happened.
Right. And it's still an active fault. They have preparations in case it recurs. But the point is that people were living in that area, and they described what happened during the conditions. They said it was so dark because they have these sand blows that erupt where the sand just fills the air.
That's important to understand because what you have is these massive chambers of gas chambers, if you will, below, maybe hundreds of feet below the surface of the earth that are just filled with pockets of air, let's say, with some kind of air. And when the earth shakes so much, those collapse and the air goes somewhere and it blasts up and it goes up through a fissure and it will carry tons and tons of material, dirt, dust, topsoil with it, and it just blows it up into the air very high, right? And they indicated that it blanketed the sun, the moon, and the stars. I couldn't see them for days.
Really?
Yeah. It was pitch darkness during that 1811, 1812 episode. And in fact, speaking of rivers, the Mississippi
scary.
River shifted in its flow and flowed backwards for like 3 hours. The river just shifted this way and the water started flowing the other way.
That is
So,
wild.
and massive destruction along all along there. Fortunately, the population was very low in the early 1800s, so it didn't affect many people or cities, but it created new lakes, it created new channels, all kinds of things were disrupted from that. So when you talk about cities sinking into the depths of the sea, you totally have it right there. In that
You have an earthquake, and that could cause it. Because how long does it say that they? So Jackson pulled up here in 3rd Nephi, where it's talking about they're overpowered by the vapor of smoke and of darkness. How does it say it was 3 days that it was dark in 3rd Nephi? Is that how it goes? Yeah, let's look real quick. Just want to find the verse.
Anyway, that whole all the description in 3rd Nephi was validated by the people who survived during this earthquake at the New Madrid Fault. And so you don't need to have a volcano. Now, you can read into the text a volcano if you want, even though there's no lava or, those type of things. And I always thought it was kind of remarkable that in 1,000 years of history in Mesoamerica, they never talked about volcanoes. Because if you've been down there, particularly in Guatemala, southern Mexico, these volcanoes dominate over the cities. And even today, they erupt and people have to evacuate. So it was a major part of their culture to deal with these volcanoes. But the Book of Mormon never talks about them.
Mm-hmm.
The only time was this one episode in 3rd Nephi.
Yeah. One I thought I have, and this kind of goes to a lot of the episodes we've been doing on like ancient temple theology in the Book of Mormon. It's interesting because in the Tree of Life vision, the thing that separates them, so there's 3 spaces that it takes part, right? There is the field, right? Then there is like the second part, which is the iron rod and the great and spacious building, and then there's the Tree of Life. And so you can overlay that onto the ancient temple, a 3-part space. Tree of Life is the Holy of Holies down there. And so the mists of darkness, now in the second room of the temple, there was an incense altar. Right. And so the whole second room would be filled with like this mist of darkness, and you would have to pass through that before you got to the veil where you would meet the Lord, right? Now think about what's happening right here. Right before it happens, there is a mist of darkness that covers them, and then the Lord reveals himself, and they touch his hands, and they touch his side. Which, when you think about when you're touching a hand in the side of a person, like you can touch their hands, like you can feel his hands and you can feel his side, right? Like there's this idea of like the divine embrace that it happens in Egypt and in other things. So that's something that like came to my mind. And if you guys are interested in that sort of conversation, if that piqued your interest, In the Language of Adam is another book. We'll have that in the description. That's what you get when you get these bonus content. We've recommended like 25 other books to these people. So people have a lot of homework. We've done a lot of homework. Yeah. So, okay, now let's get back. What are some other things from this section that you feel would be interesting to talk about, or you have more to share?
I think it's the gist of that section was to say there's different ways to interpret the text. And I think we alluded earlier to the idea of what is the narrow neck of land, right? Is the narrow neck of land the same as the narrow neck, is the same as a small neck? There are 3 different terms that they use. So in my view, I started saying, well, what if they're using 3 different terms because they're talking about 3 different places? And that makes sense to me. Other people say no, even though they use 3 different terms, they mean the same place. So that's one of those assumptions that you can draw. But the basic geography of the Book of Mormon being an hourglass shape is based on people conflating those 3 terms as one thing. If you remove that assumption and say they're 3 different things, then it opens it all up.
Which is an assumption, and that's one of the things I love about what you say. Like there's the facts, there's the assumptions, there's the interpretations, inferences, then there is the theory, and then the hypothesis.
Leading to the overall hypothesis. So I started looking into, well, how are these terms used in Joseph Smith's day, right? The narrow neck of land and the neck of land and small neck. And if you look at the writings of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, especially George Washington talking about the Revolutionary War, he often talked about we were on this narrow neck of land, and it was in the Hudson River kind of thing, or up in Boston. And that's how the terminology was used. It wasn't an isthmus between continents. It was referring to a small neck of land or a narrow neck of water or a narrow neck of land. It's different items.
And that narrow neck could be flanked as well by potentially mountains or other things. Could be. Now that doesn't necessarily fit in the plains of of Ohio, but that's another thing. And so I love the point though that you're making, which is we're all making assumptions on this stuff.
That's right.
And my biggest frustrations have come when I talk to people and they talk so matter-of-factly. It's like, I'm okay with you having your theory, but just let everybody know that there are assumptions being made here.
I'll give you a good example of what you're talking about right there. Head of the river.
The head of the river.
Okay, so one definition is where a river originates. That's one head of a river. But another definition is where two or more rivers converge. And it's depending on which one you you assume to be the case, it totally changes your geography. And in this case, it totally works to use the second interpretation, which is the confluence of major rivers, because that puts it south of Zarahemla, which is where it needs to be.
With the Ohio and the Mississippi, right?
Where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together. And that's, and when it's talking about wars, it really comes to play when they're moving armies from point to point. And you think if it's the origin place of the river, it's a little stream, it's a little brook, it's a spring coming out of a rock wall. It doesn't really present a major barrier to an army, right? But if you're talking about where the rivers converge, that's a strategic point.
Don't they get stuck at the head of the river Sidon or whatever, and they trap them there? Is that
that's
just against the river Sidon?
It talks about it being a major place in the battles where things are happening, and if you're just talking about origin, you could just go up and over it, you just go north, just go around it, right? But these are real barriers and boundaries that, to me, says you need to look at another interpretation.
It's kind of crazy because what if the Ohio and the Mississippi, what if the Lamanites are traveling on the Ohio and that's their place, and the Mississippi is mostly where the Nephites are, and that's the place where they kind of meet? Who knows? But no, this is really interesting. Do you have anything else that you want to share in regard to this?
It turns out the head of the river thing is interesting because there's in what was in Harmony, Pennsylvania, was on the Susquehanna River, right? Mm-hmm. And the Susquehanna River, the headwaters are way up in New York, far away.
Yeah.
But Jonathan Edwards, turns out, his son was a missionary to the Indians.
Okay.
And he was near Binghamton, which is further downstream from Harmony on the Susquehanna
and he's a
River.
Contemporary with Joseph Smith, his son.
The son
been.
was, yeah.
Yes.
And so, but Edwards was writing a letter about his son being at this particular area of the Indians, and he referred to it as the head of the river, but it was the conjunction of two rivers in Binghamton. And so it was funny to me to see him use that phrase in conjunction with the Susquehanna River just a few miles from where Joseph Smith was translating the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. And it had nothing to do with the headwaters. That's a different concept than the head of the river.
Yeah.
And I found several other examples of the head of the river being a conjunction.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that was a really fun conversation. I think we went down some rabbit holes that we weren't planning on, which is the point.
That's how it is, though.
That I want to bring up as well is that just going along this idea that the earth and stuff has changed so much with like that Arabia, what was it called? The Steamboat Arabia. The Mississippi River per day carries 436,000 tons of sediment per day. So 550 million metric tons a year, which extends the coast of Louisiana by 300 feet each year.
Yeah.
And so just imagine like going back thousands of years to how different the landscape was.
We have no idea.
Okay, well, if you want to really blow your mind, go on Google Earth and look at the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. Because it used to be part of the Gulf of Mexico, from where the Ohio and the upper Mississippi join. It used to be part of from there down was part of the Gulf of Mexico, and it's all been filled in over the centuries.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, even today,
and that's why it's so swampy is that why it's so swampy in those
Louisiana
is because it literally has just been built from sediment being brought down?
Well, 550 million tons, bro.
I know.
Every single year.
But even today, it's not the Coast Guard, but whoever the navigational people, they consider the lower Mississippi as a different river from the upper Mississippi.
That's why they call it, yeah.
That's why they have even though it's all one Mississippi River, navigationally it's two different rivers. But if you look on Google Earth, you can see how wide it used to be. And it was they say, especially during times when it was flooding, it was 100 miles across.
Holy cow.
So you see,
it'd be interesting to see like how much of this is just super swampy, and
it's not really.
It's probably not anymore, yeah.
And it's all. I've been all through that area. It's all controlled by dams and dikes now,
And this is common knowledge that that's how big it was.
Oh, yeah.
How long ago do they say?
Oh, there's varying estimates. But you can see right on Google Earth how big it was. And so that was one thing I thought, well, maybe that was the sea. But the scientists say it was more than 2,000 years ago that it was part of the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
And it didn't have to be anyway, because it just had to be a sea, meaning a mighty
large
river.
a body of water. Wow. Well, this has been really fun.
There's another whole
one.
aspect of this.
Yeah.
If you look at the hydrological maps of the United States, where it shows the drainage areas, that plays a big role in understanding Book of Mormon geography too. And that's a whole dissertation to discuss that. But I addressed it a little bit in the chapters that we have, but I don't know how to describe it other than to say that you could have a whole nother book about this.
Yeah.
But let me give you one last example. So I was in Tennessee, and I was visiting a ward there, and I had this Moroni's America book with me on the chair, sitting next to me. And the guy walks in and says, "Well, what's that?" And I said, "Well, it's a book about Book of Mormon geography." And I brought it just in case someone would be interested. I felt like sometimes I need to give it to somebody. And he says, "Well, what does it say?" And I said, "It says, you're living in Book of Mormon land." And he says, "You brought that book for me."
Mm-hmm.
He grabbed it. He wouldn't let go of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, everybody here has always believed we live in Book of Mormon lands, but we never hear it from anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I have another friend whose brother was not a member of the church living in Tennessee, but he was a hydrologist. He knew all the rivers in Tennessee. And when I explained this to him about the Nephites going on rivers and how the geography all worked, he said, that is the first thing that's ever made sense to me about the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's right in Tennessee. And the archaeology corroborates what the Book of Mormon says. I mean, it's fantastic.
One more thing on this rivers is that when you talk about a promised land, a land that's set aside for its rich resources and everything else, North America, aka the United States of America, has more navigable rivers than any country in the world.
Really?
By like double or triple. It's just amazing the amount of river passages that you have where you can move things. There's no country that has that rich resource available to it like you have in North America, which is one of the reasons that the nation's been so successful from the early days, being able to move product across the country, without roads and highways existing. And so clearly the Nephites would have used them extensively, since that was a gift really that came with the land.
That's really, really cool. Holy cow. Wow. Well, I'm excited to get into the next section, the final section, section 3. And so get reading it, and we'll see you after.